Welcome to our third session of the day. The previous sessions had global leaders in education offer their reflections on the first day of the summit, illuminate the importance of partnerships with youth to collaborate for change, and we watched the Refugee Education Council and Youth Dialogue participants release their youth manifesto. Okay, we're going to keep the momentum going. Let's get the next session started. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome the moderator for this next session, CEO and President of Plan International Canada, Lindsay Glasgow. I'm actually very fortunate to know Lindsay and have watched her for many years. Lindsay has dedicated her career to understanding and working with the world's most vulnerable people so they can realize their rights and reach their full potential. She leads Plan International Canada in its mission to advance children's rights and equality for girls. As a member of the Canadian International Education Policy Working Group, a coalition of Canadian civil society organizations, Plan Canada is a key partner for Canada in delivering high-quality education programming in conflict and crisis-affected settings. Lindsay, welcome. Over to you to moderate this next session.
Thank you so much, Farah, for the warm welcome, and a very warm welcome to everyone today. Un bonjour bien chaleureux à tous ceux qui sont rassemblés avec nous aujourd'hui. As we gather today to discuss education and the displacement of children from their homes and their communities, we must also acknowledge Canada's own history of colonialism. By confronting our history, we engage in the practice of truth, a starting point for reconciliation with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities. So I come to you this morning from the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. I'd like to further acknowledge Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and that this land is now home to many diverse nations, Inuit, and Métis communities. In this session, we're going to be talking about how to build solutions to the global education crisis. We're also going to discuss how to harness the power of youth and the voices of refugees and IDPs themselves to build education systems that work for everyone. Au cours de cette session, nous allons entendre ceux qui sont en première ligne de ce programme de la part de ceux qui plaident pour le changement, ceux qui construisent et investissent dans les solutions qui fonctionnent et ceux qui défendent les droits des enfants. Education is too often collateral damage of our fragile times. Yet conversely, we know that education remains the most powerful force that we have for the creation of a more peaceful, more prosperous world. Et maintenant, c'est pour moi un immense plaisir de présenter le panel aujourd'hui et de leur permettre de partager des idées et la sagesse de leur propre travail et de leur plaidoyer. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Canada's Parliamentary Secretary for International Development, Anita van den Belt. Before entering politics, Ms. van den Belt built a distinguished career in international development and human rights. She has worked in over 20 countries on inclusive governance and women's leadership, including as a senior advisor with the United Nations Development Programme and with the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Dr. Khumbu Vali-Berry is a politician and advocate who served as a Minister of Education and Literacy for Burkina Faso. Since 2016, she has been the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Rights to Education. Najiba Wazafedo is co-founder of the Global Independent Refugee Women Leaders, founding member of Global Refugee-Led Network and Asia-Pacific Network of Refugees. Dr. Shelley Whitman is the executive director of the Dallaire Institute and has been instrumental in creating several key international agreements and policies on the protection of children. Unfortunately, we were notified this morning that Ilwad Elman, who was going to also join us today, cannot make it. Nonetheless, welcome to all of you and thank you for being here today. So let's just get straight to the questions. And I'm going to start, Ms. van den Belt, with you. The first question is for you. Including the voices of those affected by displacement has been a foundational theme of this summit. Can you please tell us why you believe this is to be so critical for developing effective education responses? What do you see as the role of grassroots civil society organizations in ensuring access to education for refugees and IDPs?
Well, thank you very much for that question. And I would like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from the traditional and unceded territory of the Anishinaabe and Algonquin peoples. And it is a real pleasure to be here to hear all of these voices. And this is exactly why it is important that we do have the local voices, the people impacted, as part of the discussion and leading the discussion, because they are the ones that provide the ideas for action. And I also want to acknowledge that this is the reason why we created the Refugee Education Council, because we want to amplify those voices, especially the voices of girls and young women. And I just want to say one thing about what happens when people aren't at the table. As you mentioned, I worked for many years with UNDP, UN Women, other organizations. And in 2012, UN Women was launching the 600-page State of the World's Women document. And in the launch, the head of UN Women was asked, why is there nothing in 600 pages about women with disabilities? And it was one of those moments, the room went silent, and the person who responded said, the honest answer is that in all the people who had the pen, all the people who were researchers, none of them had experienced living with disabilities. And it's not that we were against it, we just hadn't thought of it. And that's why we need the voices of everyone who is impacted at the table, because when they're not there, we just don't think of it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Vandenbel. I mean, what a powerful example of what can happen when people and voices are not given the opportunity to sit at the table. So let me turn to Dr. Bali Ferry. You have spoken publicly about the gratitude you feel for being able to serve in the positions you have because of the society that you grew up in, one where only 2% of all girls attend school, and how that has shaped your motivation and ability to later become a Minister of Education, and now the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to education. In 2018, you wrote a report on the right to education where you focus specifically on, something's popped up on my screen, which is always an issue with virtual. I'm just going to repeat. In 2018, you wrote a report on the right to education where you focus specifically on refugees and the challenges they face and their request for an education at all levels. Since then, the challenges have obviously increased. Pouvez-vous nous dire ce que vous considérez comme les plus grands obstacles qui empêchent les enfants et les jeunes réfugiés et déplacés d'exercer leur droit à l'éducation et à l'apprentissage tout au long de la vie, et quelles recommandations feriez-vous pour réduire ces obstacles?
Oui, merci beaucoup, Madame Glasgow. C'est encore un plaisir renouvelé. Je voudrais vraiment vous remercier, mais surtout vous féliciter pour cette belle initiative, parce que notre humanité aujourd'hui en a besoin de parler à la fois de cette thématique qui est vraiment une problématique de notre humanité. Et pour moi, c'est très, très important de vous dire vraiment bravo pour ça. Bravo pour avoir l'initiative, mais aussi bravo pour avoir pris le courage de dire il faut écouter les personnes les plus concernées. Et c'est surtout sur ce point que je voudrais vraiment vous féliciter et vous encourager dans la perspective. C'est vrai que mon rapport de 2019 a fait focus beaucoup plus sur l'éducation des réfugiés. Et pour moi, les plus grands obstacles, au-delà de la dimension juridique, qui la plupart du temps, pratiquement la majorité des pays ont signé, bien sûr, la Déclaration universelle sur les droits économiques, culturels et sociaux, mais, et c'est même traduit au niveau des législations au niveau national. malheureusement, de façon concrète, les obstacles demeurent. Et le premier obstacle le plus important pour moi, ce n'est pas l'obstacle financier, c'est la capacité plutôt des politiques à avoir une réelle volonté politique. C'est la volonté politique qui est la plus déterminante par rapport à cette dimension-là. Et cette volonté politique, elle doit être à la fois au niveau pays, mais elle doit aussi se situer au niveau local, je parle des communes et des régions. Et c'est quand on n'aura pas cette volonté politique, de toute façon, on peut continuer à faire des discours, à faire des recherches, à faire des plaidoyers, mais ça ne fonctionnera pas. Pour moi, c'est vraiment le premier défi essentiel et important, c'est la volonté politique. Ensuite, il y a aussi la question des approches. On n'écoute pas les personnes les plus concernées parlant des réfugiés eux-mêmes. On ne leur donne pas la parole, on ne les écoute pas et on ne prend pas en compte ni leurs demandes ni leurs besoins. Et ça aussi, je crois que c'est le défi essentiel et important. Et le troisième défi pour moi, c'est toutes les questions à la fois administratives, organisationnelles, qui aussi s'organisent à ce niveau-là. Parce qu'un réfugié arrive dans un espace, il n'a pas de document administratif, il est vu bien sûr comme un étranger, et pour s'inscrire à l'école particulièrement, c'est la croix et la bannière. Et ça, ces aspects aussi administratifs, organisationnels, sont vraiment essentiels au niveau du défi des réfugiés. Et c'est aussi toute cette question de posture, parce que ce sont des gens qui ont tout abandonné, qui ont quitté chez eux, et leur famille et eux sont dans une situation de détresse psychologique. Et je crois que cette dimension de détresse psychologique, il faut aussi pouvoir l'adresser, et j'ai vu que dans le manifeste, vous en parlez. Et j'avoue que ça, c'est vraiment, et au-delà, bien sûr, c'est toutes ces questions de moyens, à la fois financiers et bien sûr pédagogiques aussi. Parce qu'il ne faut pas oublier que la question aussi pédagogique, comment capaciter les enseignants, mais aussi comment capaciter les communautés qui reçoivent et qui accueillent. Voilà. Donc, c'est vraiment ramasser les différents défis que je vois un peu à ce niveau-là.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bollyberry. Certainly, we've heard over the last 2 days a number of these barriers highlighted by a number of our participants, and you've just reinforced them. I wonder if you could just briefly speak to any particular barriers that girls are facing. And that's to you, Dr. Bollyberry.
Allô?
Maybe there's a... Oh.
Est-ce que vous me posez la question, c'est ça? Non?
Oui. I was just asking if you could just speak briefly to any particular barriers that girls are facing.
If I can speak?
Oui, je vais retourner si on a un peu de temps parce que je crois que maintenant on a un problème avec le temps. Alors je vais retourner.
Okay.
Alors, okay, merci. So I'm going to come to Najiba. Let me turn to you now. We know that good quality education can break cycles of conflict and violence, redefine gender norms, and promote tolerance and reconciliation. As an activist who continues to work tirelessly on education, what are the systemic changes that are needed to ensure that refugees and displaced persons have access to quality and appropriate educational programs?
Thank you very much, Lindsay, for having me. And my apology if my camera is not looking too good because I'm having an issue right now and it's very late night here down in Australia. I mean, just to quickly answer to that question, I would say that the most powerful and transformative action that the refugee response sector can make is really to enable refugees, especially refugee women and girls, to influence the decision-making, and supporting refugee-led education is a key piece when we talk about systemic change. We all know that education does protect It empowers and also enlightens the refugee youth and children. And it gives them knowledge and skills to be in a productive, fulfilling, as well as independent lives. So again, I would say giving refugee women and girls in particular a chance to learn about themselves and also about the world around them while striving to rebuild their lives and communities is so important. And I'm actually coming to you today, from a country or Afghanistan. I'm originally from Afghanistan, and right now, as you know, there's a crisis happening, and all girls are banned from access to education by the Taliban. So it's quite devastating to see that my own country girls and women are not able to go and receive the education that I'm actually advocating today. Sometimes you come down, to a stage where you think no solution will work, especially in a country like Afghanistan, where there has been decades of war. At the same time, I want to say that we know, as a matter of fact, that as pandemic hit the world, refugees' education is really what has been impacted the most. And we are working with many other refugees across the Asia region where I am from. We've been working with refugees at Cox's Bazar. We've been working with refugees at Thai-Burma border. We've been working with refugee women and girls in Indonesia and Malaysia. And to every one of them, when we talk, they actually tell us about the challenges that they have faced as a result of the pandemic, and how, it's not the same and the resources are actually shrinking. So the key lessons that we've learned from the pandemic is that even without resources, refugee communities continue to be the first and the last responders to protection. And we've seen that how refugees have turned COVID-19 as a crisis into an opportunity. They have filled the gaps and responded to the needs and facing refugee women. While many of them have been restricted from traveling, while many other international actors have been restricted from traveling. So what we need to do is to ensure that we are including quality education to many refugee women and girls, and that includes through flexible grants opportunities. What we've learned also across Asia region that and many of those that haven't been able to receive quality education in many different forms, they still continue to provide online education, keeping refugee learning centers or through ongoing volunteer work. Many refugees have used innovative ways, such as radio teaching in Cox's Bazar, or some have, tried to establish think tank group and volunteer to, try to support quality education through resettled refugee support from resettlement countries. So we can see that the lived experience of refugees, especially those in the camps who have worked to find real solutions to complex challenges, is the greatest tool that the humanitarian organization can capitalize, on achieving sustainable solutions. And it gives hopes to refugees. So despite being through a lot, all of the refugees in many different camps, in many different regions, they have had very little at the same time, and many have had nothing to live on, but they still have become responders to their own solutions. They have created a productive life by establishing schools and businesses that really have increased access to education, enhanced sustainable livelihood in their communities, and even contributed to the economy of host countries. So I want to say, and I really want to conclude by saying that many of our refugee-led initiatives are still under-resourced, despite the evidence that they can do so much. They're still underfunded. They require investment and support to continue. And this really requires investing in resources, investing in education, investing in skills, development and mentorship of refugee women and girls. And really for us to realize their potential as people with leadership, as people who could be leaders. It also requires the supported inclusion of refugee women and girls, in the planning, design, and implementation of programs and policies. And again, with this, we might need to adopt policies that promote the inclusion of refugee women and girls within the national education system. And that might also mean that we need to invest in these policy shifts. We need to catalyze sustainable change, and that means fostering the conditions for meaningful inclusion and quality education for all. And I leave it there.
You've just given us a huge amount to think about and some really good examples of innovative solutions to access to education. So thank you so much. I do have another question for you, but I think I will come back to you after we just do a first round with some of the other speakers. So I'm going to turn to you, Dr. Whitman, as the Executive Director of the Dallaire Institute. And based on your expertise on the impact of armed conflict, how important is education in the lives of children and youth? And what guidance can you give to education policymakers and practitioners on this issue?
Thank you very much, Lindsay, for this opportunity to speak today, and to the organizers of this forum. I want to just firstly start out to have everyone understand that at the Dallaire Institute, we have a vision to place children at the heart of peace and security. And that means understanding aspects most certainly related to disrupted education. Approximately 420 million children live in conflict-affected areas around the world. And as that exposure increases, so too do the risks of being recruited and used in armed violence. But despite that significant and horrific reality, many policymakers fail to understand that conflicts in which children are recruited and used in armed violence last longer, and the likelihood of conflict reoccurrence exponentially increases. The disruption of education is a tragedy that many children in armed conflict areas are forced to endure. It is critical that educational facilities, the teachers, the children, and the routes to and from school are protected also from attack. Efforts such as the Safe Schools Declaration are an important commitment for all governments to sign, but also to implement. Without the ability to return to schools or to have educators, the recovery from armed conflict is exceptionally challenging. Children impacted by armed conflict require access to education that takes into consideration the trauma and challenges they are facing. Whether it's the loss of loved ones, poverty, disease, gender-based violence, or the destruction of their homes, towns, or nations. This means we have to go beyond traditional education. We have to ensure that critical thinking, conflict resolution, empathy, and self-confidence are taught, as well as practical skills training that need to be included in this approach. Educators require programs that provide training to match these needs and to help children adapt to the realities of the future. Many children that have been impacted by armed conflict often lack trust of adults. This is normal. It is adults that create and fuel armed conflict. A recognition of the need to build trust in communities between groups who have been at odds with each other, with a focus on prioritizing children's protection, is key to the success of breaking endemic cycles of armed conflict. This is equally important here in Canada, in a host country that receives refugees as well. As we welcome children from war-affected nations all over the world, let us also do better here. Just last week, I was asked to speak at a primary school here in Canada. It was with reference to the Ukraine conflict. Teachers were reaching out to me about how to talk to children about the exposure to the images of war. And in particular, this one school had children who both came from Ukraine and Russia. The teachers were not equipped with the knowledge of the conflict, nor how to talk about conflict to the children. We need to understand that this is a global dynamic, and we have got to do better all over the world. It's imperative that children impacted by armed conflict are also provided spaces for sharing their emotions and peer-to-peer support. Education policymakers should support the allocation of resources for such creative programs that allow for inclusion of children's perspectives in their design and implementation. And that requires flexibility from the donor community, as well as more rapid responses. I want to just give one more comment, if you'll allow me. Whenever I travel to countries around the world, and I've been to many refugee camps, I've also been to interim care centers where children who have been recruited and used in armed violence have been there for receiving rehabilitation. In 2015, I was in Pibor, South Sudan, and met with children who had just recently been released from the Cobra faction armed group. I asked the children in the typical way that I always do as an icebreaker, what do you want to become when you grow up? Many raised their hands and shouted, a pilot. All goods in and out of Pibor must be flown in. And so the children of that community saw the importance of such an education and opportunity to uplift their entire community. And this, I want to say to everyone, is such an incredibly important message for us to remember, is that just as the previous panelists for the Refugee Education Council were commenting, so many children who come from armed conflict have so many wonderful ideas, skills, and contributions to give. And we've got to recognize that and how it will not only help those communities, but our world as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Whitman. You are so right. They have so much to give, so many ideas. I'm going to now return to you, Parliamentary Secretary Vanden Belde. Can you explain why human rights and conflict-sensitive approaches are a central part of Canada's Together for Learning campaign?
Thank you very much. And from the beginning in our Together for Learning campaign, we have always made a conscious effort to make sure we're hearing the voices of many stakeholders, and especially refugees and displaced children and youth. This is extremely important, but it's also very, very important that we do look at human rights and that we look at conflict sensitivity and gender equality in all of the programming. This is something that we know that trauma, and we've heard today that trauma impacts the way in which these young people can learn. We heard just now about the issues with trust. We also know that the way in which education can be delivered is impacted by conflict. But more importantly, the education itself can lead to conflict prevention and prevention of radicalization. And it depends very much on how that education is delivered. It has to be sensitive to all of the environment in which the children and youth are learning. And in order to do that, of course, we have to include women and young women and adolescents. That's why the Charlevoix Declaration was so important. We've actually reduced barriers to about 4 million young girls and adolescent girls through that. But we really have to listen. We have to make sure that it is reaching the people who need it most in the way that they need it most. And that includes things like teaching human rights, teaching empathy, the kinds of things that we heard from other panelists today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Again, some really, really important themes around trust, the dealing with trauma. And it brings me back to the question I had wanted to ask Najeeba earlier, which is something that stood out to me from discussions yesterday. And that was the importance of responding to the impact of trauma and displacement on mental health of children and youth. And so I wondered, Najeeba, if you could tell us a little bit about why mental health and psychosocial support needs to be prioritized when supporting education for refugees and displaced children and youth, and why it is just such a critical piece of any response.
Thank you for that question. I would say that, refugees and migrants often face war and persecution just the way I did myself. We face extreme hardship in our countries of origin, and many experience displacement and hardship in transit countries as well, and they embark on dangerous travels. And again, this will include lack of information, uncertainty about immigration status, the potential hostility, the changing policy, the undignified and unprotected detention, all of this additional stress. So forced migration, really does erode pre-migration protective supports like those provided by extended family, and may also challenge cultural, religious, and other gender identities. So I would say that, refugees face harsh conditions that put their mental health under significant stress, while, you know, many of us might show remarkable resilience, but some of us really do need extra support to rebuild our lives, to overcome the ongoing trauma that we've experienced in our home country. So in many refugee situations, especially as mental health professionals are not present, especially within the camps, so we really need to ensure that we have mental health services available for children and adolescents in particular. And if we have these are available, then we're making a huge difference even in their quality education learning. For instance, when we talk to refugees in the camps, a lot of them, they say that they don't have access to refugee health nurses while trying to, learn education. I think learning quality education requires investment in mental health. Otherwise, if you're not able to look at the mental health needs, then we are not investing in quality education, and they will not, and children will not be able to learn education effectively. We require policies and intervention that is specifically for mental health, giving the unique and often acute mental health needs for internally displaced people, refugees, and asylum seekers.
Very clear answer, Najiba. Thank you very much. Maintenant, Dr. Bolibari, j'espère que vous avez temps de répondre à une autre question. Pouvez-vous nous parler de certains des obstacles spécifiques auxquels les filles réfugiées et déplacées pourraient être confrontées et de ce que nous pouvons faire pour surmonter ces obstacles?
Oui, merci beaucoup encore, Lindsay. Et I want to say thank you for all the panelists who has already highlighted those issues and challenges for refugees education. I think, donc je voudrais juste dire que pour moi, le premier élément important, et c'est de cela que je parlais tout à l'heure, c'est la volonté politique. Comment faire pour s'assurer qu'il y ait de la volonté politique dans ce processus-là de prise en charge des réfugiés? C'est d'avoir déjà une vision, j'ai dit bien une vision de la société. C'est quel type de société que nous souhaiterions construire? Si nous voulons une société pacifiste, si nous voulons une société inclusive, si nous voulons une société équitable, où chaque citoyen et chaque citoyenne jouit de ses droits, je crois que c'est pour moi ça la première perspective importante. Et ça, c'est vraiment d'abord une question de volonté politique. Et dans cette vision politique, vision sociétale à construire, il va falloir l'exemple de l'Afghanistan. L'éducation des filles et des femmes était à un niveau essentiel et important. Mais aujourd'hui, voilà, quand on regarde la dimension politique, on voit que ce sont des choix politiques. Et ces choix politiques nous ramènent bien sûr en arrière sur la question des inégalités. Et donc pour moi, ça c'est vraiment important. Et le rôle de la société civile dans la construction de cette vision sociétale, elle est essentielle. Le rôle, bien sûr, des réfugiés eux-mêmes en tant qu'organisation, les gens qui sont des sans-voix, leur donner la voix, pour s'assurer qu'ils soient présents et qu'ils comptent et qu'ils disent leur voix et qu'ils se défendent. Je crois que ça, c'est vraiment essentiel dans la construction aussi de cette société équitable, pacifique, où chaque être humain a le droit, bien sûr, de s'exprimer et d'avoir, bien sûr, le droit à l'éducation. Le deuxième défi important pour moi, c'est toutes ces questions aussi qui sont liées, on a parlé de mental health. C'est clair, les réfugiés arrivent dans un contexte toujours difficile. Et pour moi, comment s'assurer qu'ils arrivent dans un contexte sain? C'est la communauté d'accueil. Il faut absolument que la communauté d'accueil soit disponible pour accepter les réfugiés qui arrivent. Et pour ça, ce sont des communications qu'il faut faire, mais c'est aussi déjà l'éducation de base dans ces communautés, déjà depuis la petite tendre enfance, le préscolaire, déjà, on devrait pouvoir introduire des valeurs parce que c'est ça qui va régler les problèmes. Si un enfant déjà à un bas âge est capable d'accepter l'autre, d'avoir de l'empathie, d'avoir de la tolérance, mais aussi du respect de l'autre et de ne pas avoir peur de l'autre. Mais ça commence au préscolaire. Et vraiment, ça doit être, et ça doit continuer dans les autres ordres d'enseignement. Mais je dis aussi, ça, l'éducation primaire, préscolaire, secondaire, supérieure, mais c'est aussi les autres ordres d'éducation, c'est-à-dire l'éducation non formelle pour les adultes, pour les adolescents, qui doivent être éduqués à la paix, aux valeurs. Et pour moi, c'est aussi essentiel d'avoir cette cohésion et l'éducation aussi informelle. Je dis non formelle, mais aussi informelle. Les réseaux sociaux aujourd'hui, tout ce qui est drainé au niveau des réseaux sociaux en termes vraiment de messages de haine, il va falloir que quelque part, on puisse aussi adresser ces questions-là, parce que c'est ça qui va permettre de construire un environnement sain. J'ai dit, c'est aussi d'avoir une vision holistique de ce que c'est que l'éducation, mais ce que c'est que la vie d'un être humain, et surtout d'un réfugié. Parce que dans mon rapport, j'insistais pour dire que tant qu'on n'a pas la vision holistique du système éducatif, en ce qui concerne particulièrement les réfugiés, on ne pourra pas aller de l'avant. Il faut vraiment que ce soit une approche par les droits. En termes de perspective, c'est vraiment important parce qu'il faut que les familles de ces réfugiés aient une vie économique décente. Il va falloir que toutes les questions, bien sûr, de santé mentale, mais aussi de sécurité, donc d'environnement sécuritaire, soient prises en charge. Et toutes les questions, par exemple, de recherche de travail, mais toutes les questions aussi d'environnement à construire, ce sont des éléments essentiels pour les réfugiés. Donc, c'est vraiment d'avoir cette capacité de créer une sorte de vision holistique de l'ensemble des perspectives et des enjeux qui constituent les problèmes. En tout cas, pour moi, c'est ça qui va être l'élément fédérateur, c'est vraiment cette vision multipartenariale, multi-acteurs, mais aussi avec des approches plus holistiques où les communautés, les enseignants, le secteur privé est aussi impliqué parce qu'on voit de plus en plus la commercialisation de l'éducation au niveau des réfugiés à travers l'introduction des TIC. Et c'est aussi une question fondamentale de droit qu'il va falloir continuer à adresser. Parce que pour moi, de toute façon, l'obligation première, ce sont les gouvernements qui ont l'obligation première de donner le droit à l'éducation aux réfugiés. Ce n'est pas un privilège, mais c'est un droit. C'est juste pour ça que je continue encore à vous encourager et à vous dire d'aller de l'avant en créant ces réseaux-là, mais surtout en vous assurant que la base première, c'est quel type de société nous voulons. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. Merci beaucoup, Dr. Bolibari. And thank you to everyone for incredible insights and for highlighting once again that education is key to enabling children and youth to contribute to peace building, more gender equal societies, and creating prosperity for all. I'd like to turn for a moment back to the Youth Manifesto, which we've heard so much about over the last day and a half. It really provides such a powerful vision with so many critical elements in the areas of inclusion, mental health, and psychosocial support, digital learning, gender equality, and accountability. And I'd like to ask each of you just to take a minute to tell us a recommendation from the manifesto that specifically stood out to you and that you think we should prioritize. Tough to prioritize, I realize, because there's so much there. But if there's one thing that you really wanted to draw attention to, what would it be? I'd like to start with you, Dr. Whitman, then on to Najiba, then Dr. Bolibari, and finally Parliamentary Secretary Vandenveld. So, Dr. Whitman.
Thank you so much. Firstly, I was really struck by so many wonderful things in the manifesto, as you highlighted. But I was also really very pleased to read that there was a call on all education ministers and policymakers around the world to implement curricula that teaches inclusion, tolerance, and peace at early grades. Without that basis for learning, we will continually face challenges of perceptions of others that can be demeaning and damaging to our communities and the world at large. And we have to break this normalization of violence that exists. So for me, that was exceptionally wonderful to see that included. And just to reiterate that this is something that we do at a much earlier phase, because we know that children learn their perceptions of others around the ages of 9, 10 to 12, 13. So if we can start this at an earlier phase, I really do see that it would have a huge impact on our world. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm not surprised you chose that one. I was actually going to ask you as a follow-up question what your message to ministries of education would be when it comes to dealing with children in armed conflict. And you kind of just alluded to that. I don't know if there's anything else you would want to expand on, but I was going to ask you that question.
Thanks. Yeah, no, exactly. That would be something I would call upon without a doubt. But I just think that one of the things that occurs is sometimes we have these discussions at a much later phase in education, but there's a lot of children who also don't get access to education in those later phases. Maybe one point I would follow on with, though, would be also as someone who's at a post-secondary institution. And, you know, if I think about Ishmael Bea's perspective with respect to having, you know, your documentation to demonstrate whether you're qualified and capable to undertake such education. I really do feel that there is also something at that level that governments need to promote for young people who come as refugees or from conflict affected areas, to be able to be given a shot, given a try, and also to be able to support them with financial resources to do that. So in order for us to have a bit of a more of an equilibrium when we're looking at access to this higher education.
Thank you. Thank you for expanding on that. Najeeba, what would be your one priority or takeaway from the manifesto?
Sure. I mean, I would say, from looking at the manifesto, I would say solidarity and understanding of intersectionality. It's good to see that it is an essential to achieving, our shared objective on gender equality. It was great to kind of see the reflection that we really need to understand the causes of gender inequality, which is being universal, regardless of where you're coming from. I mean, at least for me, the pursuit of gender equality in my home country, Afghanistan, is unlikely to take the same route as it will in Canada, for instance. The context is important, but the root causes of discrimination and inequality are the same. Unfair gender roles, normalized abuse and harassment, and the tendency to undermine women, in order to exert control over them. I would really conclude by saying how important it is to actually promote the full and active participation of refugee women and girls in all their diversity. Greater support must be given to refugee women's leadership opportunities, and that is through enhancing and increasing education opportunities, at all levels, and addressing the barriers to education through supporting mental health and psychosocial services.
Thank you very much, Najeeba. And now over to you, Dr. Bali Berry, on what stood out for you in the manifesto.
Thank you so much. Je voudrais vraiment encore réinsister par rapport à votre manifeste. Il est excellent parce qu'il aborde des vrais enjeux, mais insister déjà sur la première partie, donc le premier paragraphe. Pour moi, c'est essentiel. C'est vrai, c'est de dire que les réfugiés, quand on leur donne des compétences, quand ils sont aussi bien formés, ça leur permet d'être autonomes, mais aussi de s'insérer dans les communautés. Mais ce n'est pas suffisant. Je crois que ce qui est essentiel, c'est que les gens sachent que nous sommes en train de construire une humanité conjointe, une humanité commune, collective. Et c'est ça qui est essentiel. C'est dire, ce n'est pas seulement pour les réfugiés, mais c'est aussi pour les gens qu'on trouve dans les pays. Ceux qui reçoivent les réfugiés bénéficient aussi des compétences de ces réfugiés, du travail que ces réfugiés vont faire, de la spiritualité que ces gens vont pouvoir aussi leur donner et du type de leadership qu'ils vont apprendre aussi de ces personnes. Et donc, pour moi, c'est s'assurer que notre humanité, elle est commune. C'est vraiment une humanité commune. Donc, votre manifeste, pour moi, elle doit d'abord être bâtie sur ça. Parce que c'est ça l'essentiel. C'est ça vraiment l'essence, hein, de pouvoir dire, donnons de l'espace aux réfugiés, écoutons-les. Il faut partir pour moi d'abord de ce postulat de base. Ensuite, je suis tout à fait d'accord avec toutes les propositions des autres pour dire il faut casser le cercle de violence qui existe et ce cercle vicieux où les réfugiés sont perçus comme des gens qui viennent. Ça fait partie de l'histoire du monde. Il y en aura toujours. Chaque fois qu'il y aura des conflits, chaque fois qu'il y aura des catastrophes, etc., etc. Et ça, j'ai dit, c'est l'éducation de base. Il faut absolument que ça commence déjà depuis le préscolaire où on apprend les valeurs à chaque citoyen et à chaque citoyenne. Et ça, c'est vraiment, pour moi, le premier levier, le plus essentiel, c'est l'éducation aux valeurs. Et en commençant déjà par la petite enfance, mais en l'intégrant dans toutes les autres sphères du système éducatif, du préscolaire jusqu'à l'enseignement supérieur, en passant par l'éducation non formelle, mais aussi l'éducation informelle avec les médias. Si on arrive déjà à faire ça, et on arrive à construire une société civile, mais décentralisée. Je dis bien décentralisée, parce que c'est important d'avoir ces réseaux au niveau mondial qui parlent, mais c'est aussi essentiel, parce que souvent, ce n'est pas un problème de ressources financières. Il y a souvent des ressources financières dans les pays, au niveau local. Malheureusement, ces ressources financières sont destinées à autre chose. Et ça, c'est la force de la société civile au niveau local pour pouvoir justement faire du dialogue politique et s'assurer que les ressources sont priorisées et elles doivent aller dans l'éducation, mais surtout dans les droits humains des réfugiés et des populations les plus marginalisées. Et pour moi, c'est vraiment ça qu'il faut peut-être arriver aussi à construire à ce niveau-là. Et vraiment vous remercier encore et vous souhaiter le meilleur pour la suite et vous dire que ce manifeste, il est essentiel, mais il ne faut pas qu'il reste au niveau seulement international. Il faut que ces paroles et ces messages arrivent jusqu'au niveau local, parce que c'est là où les changements peuvent se faire au mieux. Merci beaucoup et encore félicitations.
Merci à vous, Dr. Balibari. I'll now turn to Parliamentary Secretary Vandenbel to also answer the key recommendation that stood out for you that you think we should prioritize.
Yes, thank you very much. I would say that what has struck me the most particularly in my current role is the call to donor and host countries to not leave refugee children and displaced persons behind. It's really the leave no one behind message. We know that the Youth Manifesto is really the first step, but there has to be accountability. And in order to do that, it is up to us to action it. That, for us, includes bringing it up at the UN Secretary General Transforming Education Summit that's happening in September. But really what it means is that we have to take the solutions that are in the Youth Manifesto and really become the champions of bringing it forward and really make sure that we leave no one behind.
Thank you. Lots of excellent interventions and thoughts. I particularly appreciated that this manifesto cannot just stay at the highest level as a document. It really needs to come down right to the local level in order to leave no one behind. So with that, I just want to thank you once again for all of your insights and introduce fellow Canadian Robert Jenkins, who is the Director of Education and Adolescent Development at UNICEF, to offer some reflections on what he has heard during this session. Over to you, Robert.
Well, thanks very much. Thanks very much for this opportunity. I just also want to express my appreciation to the Government of Canada for organizing this, for leading this, and also the amazing panelists and moderation of this session. I'm currently in Guatemala on a trip to Honduras. Apologies, I hope the connection will be fine. But I learned a lot, and what my takeaways are the following, just to offer very briefly. One is, I really appreciate the emphasis in the manifesto, but by the panelists, of the involvement of girls and women, refugee and displaced girls and women in particular, in the policy-making process, planning, management. I saw it myself here just most recently, like yesterday, saw it a couple of days ago in El Salvador. Amazing ideas, articulation of goals, personal goals of girls, of displaced girls, but also of policymakers and engaging with policymakers. And I really feel that's part of the solution, and really appreciate the panelists also bringing it up. And that was a clear consensus, and obviously also highlighted in the manifesto. I also think innovation, new approaches. My simple take on the, and we heard it yesterday too in the earlier discussions. When we look globally, there are many trends that can be quite disturbing, negative, and worrying. But there are these amazing innovations at local level of individuals that show us sort of the way that indeed girls and women, particularly displaced girls, refugees, and who can realize their rights to education, they can access learning opportunities, they can realize their full potential. So translating these tangible lessons and actions from the ground at scale across many countries, or to address the disturbing global trends, I think is a key challenge, which is clearly also outlined in the manifesto. Just a couple of final remarks. One is, we do indeed have a long way to go collectively. Just take a look at in the response to the COVID pandemic, the very limited resources that were allocated from COVID stimulus packages around the world in high-income and low-income countries to education. It's just an indication that indeed education continues to be at the kind of lower down in the priority list in times of crisis, including of large-scale displacements and refugee populations. But all of us here and all the panelists clearly articulated the importance of bringing education up to the front of that queue and recognizing how important education is, including during times of fragility and humanitarian responses. Resources has been raised by a number of panelists. Indeed, more resources are needed around the world, including where I am right now, to reach and effectively program and enable displaced girls and women, refugees, to have access to quality education. And indeed, this is also a worrying area in terms of the trends on the needs of developing. So I'm glad that was raised, and I'm glad that we see sort of a critical mass of led by Government of Canada, but many other panelists and discussions that took place over the last couple of days are clearly mobilized to address that challenge. So thanks again for this opportunity. Congratulations to the panelists and to the moderator, and I look forward to staying very closely engaged. All the best.
Thank you, Rob, for your insights. I think we all see you traveling in a car in Guatemala, so impressive that you're managing to multitask. I heard most of it. Some, in honesty, was cut off, but I heard you speak about innovation, the importance of involving girls and women as part of the solution. And, I think we did hear Najeeba in particular speak to the transformative impact of education that goes beyond learning, and how schools can be a platform for interventions that help save children's lives. I mean, we know that schools protect children and girls from disease through immunization campaigns. They ensure nutrition through school feeding programs. They provide access to water and sanitation. They protect children from violence, abuse, and exploitation. And, we all know that schools bring peace and help end conflict. So thank you. Youth are telling us that they believe in this manifesto in a world where all of youth have access to quality education and lifelong learning. And they're demanding education that teaches gender equality, inclusion, and peace. And they're calling for curricula that are responsive to the needs of refugee and displaced youth, especially the most marginalized. Nous avons entendu ces jeunes et nous devons agir en fonction de l'urgence de leur témoignage. Leur leadership et notre action sont impératives et nous en avons besoin davantage. So without targeted initiatives and partnerships for education that involve the whole of the international community, including youth, we will not deliver on the Sustainable Development Goals. We will fall short of our commitment to leave no one behind. But if we come together, we can be an unstoppable force for change. Je tiens à remercier tous ceux qui sont réunis aujourd'hui pour discuter de l'importance de la voix des jeunes déplacés dans le domaine de l'éducation. I must say that it's been quite humbling and an honor to moderate this discussion with all of you. So I thank you once again. And to all of those who are listening, please join me in applauding our honored speakers. And also my sincere thanks to the Refugee Education Council and Global Affairs Canada for hosting this event. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lindsay. I hope that the action that we see is a lot faster than the car that we just witnessed. So with that, thank you very much for your moderation. You did a wonderful, wonderful job. And thank you to all of our participants for an incredibly insightful discussion.